When one thinks of major companies in the automobile industry, countries such as the United States, Japan, Italy, France, and the United Kingdom may come to mind. But despite what it may seem, none of these are the most productive country in the industry. That title belongs to China. Once one of the most underdeveloped automobile industries, it has since become one of the more competitive sectors, and through the first decade of the century, the country rapidly increased in development, eventually producing more vehicles than any other country at the time. But the government never seriously considered developing their automobile industry until the 80s, and at that point, the companies aforementioned had already become giants. So how did China catch up? What strategies were used to propel it to one of the most active places in the automotive sector? After the rise of the People's Republic of China and the beginning of the Cold War, China began building a domestic automobile industry to increase the mobility of the country. This was partly to transport produce from the countryside, and also to modernize the military in case of an outbreak of war. To foster an idea of self-reliance, the government set up plans to build factories that would produce commercial vehicles. But to get the industry started, automobile engineers from the Soviet Union were contracted, and as a result, Chinese models closely resemble Soviet trucks. This was because the Chinese government followed the idea that Soviet technology and methods were superior to the rest of the world, and interfering with them would be sabotaging their potential. During this time, very little attention was put towards manufacturing passenger vehicles. By 1958, the Hongqi mark was established as a series of luxury vehicles meant for transporting leaders and officials. A few other state-run manufacturers would follow, but from the beginning of China's industry until the early 60s, very rarely would more than 100 passenger vehicles be produced in a year. In 1966, Chairman Mao Zedong began the Cultural Revolution, a political movement meant to solidify communist ideals in the country while purging capitalist ones. Unfortunately, this movement severely harmed industrialization in the country, including that of the automotive industry. During this time, the industry upheld the philosophy of self-reliance due to the breaking of Soviet ties in the 1960s and the capitalist ideas of other automotive hotspots.
And you'll find this wonderful rocket engine car is so easy to own, too. Especially right now while your Olds dealer is offering extra generous travel time deals. So why not stop in and travel test a 1958 Olds at your Oldsmobile dealers real soon.
However, it's clear when comparing Chinese models to Western models of the time that there was a technology gap. But China refused to import or collaborate with capitalist nations. These reasons contributed to China's automotive industry falling further and further behind in comparison to countries well established, such as the United States or Japan. Industrialization resumed after the death of Mao Zedong and the end of the Cultural Revolution. Passenger vehicles still were not a focus to the state-owned manufacturers, but the demand for taxis rose when China became a popular tourist attraction.
We hired a taxi to drive us through the bicycle and pedestrian crowded streets of the city. There were practically no private cars until we found the street on which the former Nanyang College was located.
This began a trend of importing large amounts of passenger vehicles, with the most popular ones being the Japanese cars such as the Toyota Crown or the Nissan Bluebird. Only 52 vehicles were imported in 1977, but by 1985, as many as 350,000 cars and trucks were imported. Import duties as high as 260% were imposed to stop so much spending on foreign models. China's domestic manufacturers were saved by these high tariffs, but if the companies were to ever survive, they needed to seriously consider catching up. No longer did hiding from competition seem like an option. The people had spoken, the foreign vehicles were better. It was now up to the domestic manufacturers to find a way to gain that technology for themselves. China made plans to produce light trucks and passenger cars, but these manufacturers also needed to find a way to rapidly increase their technology and their production to have a standing chance against foreign companies. This led to two particularly unorthodox strategies. One of the earliest strategies these companies took up was the setup of joint ventures. Joint ventures are a strategy similar to collaboration with the Soviets in the 1950s, only this time it's two-sided. Foreign car countries had little to no chance of ever getting a foothold in China due to the heavy import duties. But if a foreign company were to sign an agreement with a domestic company to produce the vehicles in their own factories, the foreign vehicles could be sold in China. It was a two-way trade. The foreign company would not only supply the vehicles, but also provide assistance and education in learning the technology. In return, the domestic companies would sell the foreign vehicles in the Chinese market. The earliest company to do this was state-owned Shanghai Car Plant, nowadays known as SAIC Motor Corporation. They were in talks about some sort of collaboration between them and Volkswagen as early as the 70s. Response was positive, and in 1984, Shanghai Volkswagen was founded. Other companies followed suit in order to discover new technologies and gain experience in assembly line production. Generally, this worked. The joint ventures gave rise to more factory production, and the Chinese were able to work with and learn from the more reputable companies and their products. But it wasn't always so perfect. One issue was the question of whether or not the Chinese engineers were really learning anything, or if they were just repeating the motions. The learning process was reportedly slow, and oftentimes, all that was learned was how to assemble the parts, not how to make or design their own. But the major flaw was that the foreign groups had no incentive to sell their best vehicles in the country. Very few automotive policies were set up in China, such as safety, fuel economy, or carbon footprint. And setting up these policies would be risky. Since all of the Chinese companies were technologically behind, they may have been unable to conform to these policies. The risk that these laws would kill off China's domestic production was great, so there wasn't much that China could implement. Later on, in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization and were forced to set up these policies. However, this was 2 decades later, when the Chinese companies were well established and could put in the money and research to comply, even if they were still technologically lacking. Regardless, Chinese joint ventures were an unorthodox and aggressive strategy. The idea that a foreign company had to give to the state-owned companies in order to sell their product there can be seen as a mutual agreement, but it can also be interpreted as hostage. However, this wasn't the only aggressive tactic to come out of China. Bootlegs from China are a very common sight, and even with automobiles, it's no exception. Bootlegs and clones are common in China due to underdeveloped copyright and intellectual property laws, as well as poor enforcement. In fact, the modern Chinese laws regarding intellectual property are even newer than the Chinese automobile industry itself, making them harder to enforce. There is an exploit in Chinese law that automakers can use to their advantage. To receive copyright protection, foreign companies are required to receive Chinese patents, as patent protection from their originating countries is not recognized. Article 24 of China's patent law protects new designs from being copied within 6 months of presentation, if they were first presented at an auto show or some other recognized conference. However, this implies that once those 6 months have passed, it can be copied or patented by others. There have been cases where foreign automakers failed to apply for a patent, which makes copyright protection more difficult. The first company to use this exploit to their advantage was Chery Automobile. Founded in 1997, the company began by purchasing and stocking excess parts off of the Shanghai Volkswagen assembly line, or from other companies who had supplied them. The spare parts were used to make Chery's first car, the Funyun. The use of spare parts in its creation is clear when comparing it to the Volkswagen Santana. The car may not have been luxurious in the slightest, But since it was cheap to build, it was also cheap to sell, going up against foreign competitors at a fraction of the price. Chery's next car was the QQ, nowadays seen as an icon of Chinese automobiles. Once again, the marketing strategy was to sell the car at an incredibly low price compared to its competitors. One of these competitors in question was the Daewoo Matiz, sold in China as the Chevrolet Spark. The two cars have an uncanny resemblance, and the Spark was being produced in Shanghai as well, so it would be no surprise if Chery once again built the car from spare parts, although this cannot be confirmed. Despite Chery's lower quality and lack of reputation, their model sold 70,000 units by the time September 2004 rolled around. In contrast, only 6,000 Sparks had been sold. General Motors sued Chery for unfair competition. Despite criticism that journalists had pointed towards Chery, the lawsuit was flawed from the beginning. According to the State Intellectual Property Office of China, General Motors had never filed a patent, and the government refused to come to its aid. In the end, the two groups settled out of court. Chery's reputation to foreigners was tainted, but had they not taken a safe route by using pre-existing components, and had they not used such a clever business method to become a formidable company, would they have grown into the flourishing company they are today? Chery hasn't received an accusation of ripping off another company since 2006, which, for a company that started in 1997, is a fairly long time. The knockoff strategy may have just been their way to test the waters and get their brand started. Other companies have imitated this business strategy since. Even large companies with ambition have taken this questionable route, such as BYD with their F3 model, a clone of the Toyota Corolla. Or the Great Wall Perry, which resembles a Fiat Panda. The most recent event involving knockoff accusation was a successful lawsuit by Land Rover against JAC and their Landwind brand. The Landwind X7 resembles a Land Rover Range Rover Evoque, even down to the lettering on the front. It appears that such models are often the earlier ones in a company's timeline. Once they have enough capital and brand recognition, a repeat offender will often begin to find their own image. These factors have led China's automotive industry to where it is today. Numerous factories, massive production, and heaps of potential. The only thing we haven't seen from them yet is worldwide brand recognition. Even earlier corporations, such as Dongfeng and SAIC, haven't made it to the major American or European markets yet. But, at the rate the industry is growing, that day may come soon enough.